Hi, Year 13. This lecture is looking at postmodernism and feminism. In front of you are three key ideas that, according to postmodernists, are linked to the modern society of the past. Enlightenment, the growth of the nation-state, and the process of urbanization. Now, these all link to the activity on the next slide. Okay, just to give you an idea of how we've moved away from a modern society. The concepts in the very middle box, they're all to do with modernity. And the ideas in the white boxes around the outside, they are all concepts that you might know and theories associated with a modern society or modernism. The purple boxes are all to do with a postmodern world. So, for example, A, globalization, C, social class is no longer a form of identity. So please have a quick look at those and just categorize them clearly into modern and postmodern ideas. So, how can we explain some of the recent changes in society? There are two camps of debate here. Some sociologists argue that the changes have been so significant that we've moved from a modern to a postmodern society. This is the postmodern debate, or the postmodern argument. What evidence is there that we live in a postmodern society? So when you look at the news, is there any evidence? Any evidence in schools, families of a postmodern society? Others argue that modern society has simply evolved, but it's still fundamentally the same, and we need to adapt some of the old theories to help explain the current ones. So, for example, Marxism may no longer be relevant to today's society, however, neo-Marxism is, and you've got branches of neo-functionalism as well. Okay, so is there any evidence that we still live in a modern society? Can you still see some evidence of class, for example, or gender or ethnicity? Postmodern ideas argue that society today, or the world today, is characterized by instability, risk, fragmentation, diversity, and a media-saturated global village. People's identities are now defined by what they consume, not their parents, not their class, not their gender. They reject the grand theories of the modern period, like functionalisms and Marxists' attempt to explain how society works. They reject what they call grand theories, and they also reject meta-narratives like science and even religious explanations for how the world operates. Okay? And they argue that such theories have become irrelevant in a postmodern society. People now have a fragmented sense of identity. There are multiple classes that people might move up and down in their lifetime. People have multiple genders or different ideas of their gender identity, multiple sexualities, different jobs, different family types, plenty of types of diversity. Now, if you want any more detail on Foucault, you need to look at page 256 in your textbooks. His big concept is there is a discourse of truth. The argument that a discourse is a set of ideas that become established as true knowledge, a bit similar to Kuhn's idea of paradigms existing in science. In today's society, we generally believe that our discourse is science, and science can tell us what is true. So, for example, madness is defined by psychiatrists as schizophrenics, multiple personality disorder, or what have you. Whereas, 200 years ago, religious figures would have made the diagnosis, and they would have defined it as someone possessed of spirits. The only thing that's changed is people's idea about what is truth. Religious truth as being changed for scientific truth. Foucault argues that as a result, there is no absolute truth. There are no certain universal truths that will be here forever. One has simply replaced the other. Now, I'm really sorry that part of your PowerPoint is now cut off this lecture, but I will finish it. He argued that truth is a relative idea. Truth is only truth for those who believe it. So some people in the world may believe that madness is caused by spirits. It doesn't mean that their idea is any less true. It's true for them. They believe it. Some believe that herbal remedies can cure cancer. Can they? And if they can't cure cancer, does that make that idea any less true? Now, if you're Foucault, you would say, well, no, it's still true because the people who take those herbal remedies believe them to be true. So for him, truth is relative. Theories of late modernity can be used to evaluate postmodern ideas. They say that modern society is still here, but it is evolving. But social change has gone into overdrive. Enlightenment still stands. It's possible to discover objective knowledge in order to improve society. It's worth noting that postmodernists are generally quite negative about the future of society. They believe we're literally descending into a risk-driven, sort of chaotic future of fragmented identities, which isn't very positive. Whereas modern sociologists believe that we can still use rational thought and scientific discovery to improve the world around us. Giddens is one of our key late modernity sociologists. Again, it seems to have cut off, so I'm really sorry about this. He argued that because traditions and customs no longer guide our behaviour, we're now becoming much more individualistic and reflexive, in the sense that, for example, sons no longer naturally fall into the careers of their fathers. Reflexivity is basically the idea that we are constantly modifying our actions in light of new information and new risks. Nothing is fixed anymore. So, for example, culture is unstable and it's constantly changing. And he argued that we are exposed to more risks in modern society, but we can use rational plans to reduce risks and achieve a better society. Beck develops this idea of a risk society. He's also a late modernity sociologist. He believed in the power of reason to create a better world, so very much of the Enlightenment movement. But he said we do face new dangers. Before, the dangers we faced were very much natural, so for example, droughts and earthquakes. However, now we face manufactured risks, predominantly created by science. So for example, global warming, war, and pollution. He said, we are becoming more risk conscious and we change our behaviour in order to deal with the risks about us. So, for example, nowadays we are constantly being bombarded with media stories, I suppose, about ingredients and foods and what we should be looking out for. And he said things like just simply reading the labels on foods and maybe not buying the products that are high salt means that we're changing our behaviour because we're aware of risks and therefore we're adapting to such risks. Now, what's worth making a note about Beck is he is very critical of the role of the media in distorting our perception of risk and over-exaggerating it. But he is hopeful for the future. He believes that new political movements, such as environmentalism, will challenge the risks created by technology and industrial development. However, some of the criticisms of late modernists is that not all people can be reflexives when exposed to risk. So poor people may be aware they live in a bad area with bad air quality, but they lack the funds to move elsewhere. A Marxist criticism is that actually it's capitalism that's the main source of risk, not technology and science. And quite simply, environmentalism is too fragmented to bring about real social change. They do not offer a realistic alternative to what's predominantly going on in society. There's also a branch of postmodern Marxism. Now, unsurprisingly, they argue that our current form of postmodernism is actually the product of capitalism. Okay, if you remember, Marx argues everything that happens in society is a product of the economy. They do emphasise the importance of media images, diversity and stability. And they argue that our current form of postmodern capitalism has emerged from periods of rapid economic change, so such as the 1970s banking crisis, possibly a more recent crisis in 2012, as a way of regaining profitability. We've had a shift away from industrial production, okay, so big industrial production, to fashion industry, the service sector, .com companies, And all of this has weakened the working class. Instead, we have the emergence of a wide range of oppositional movements, such as environmentalism, anti-racism, and women's liberation. Now, postmodernist Marxists believe that these movements could combine to bring about change, and this does link somewhat to Gramsci's idea of the working class presenting an alternative hegemonic bloc to the dominance of capitalism. So postmodernist Marxists are quite optimistic that these other groups could bring about the social change they are interested in. Now, feminist theories, just to remind you, I'm going to go through this very quickly because you guys have been doing feminism for quite a while. I'm sure you know it all very well. Society is male-dominated, aka patriarchal. They seek to explain the changing position of women in society. The feminist theories are both a theory and a political movement. They have roots in the Enlightenment movement, such as liberty and equality, similar ideas to Marxism. The first wave was the 19th century suffragettes campaign, and the second wave was the 1960s on a global scale. Now, for some reason, 8 and 9 have been cut off. They criticise mainstream society for being male-stream, seeing society from a male perspective. That's male-stream, all one word. And there are disagreements in the causes of subordination and how to resolve it. In fact, there are 3 branches that we're going to be looking at today. The first one is liberal or reformist feminism. These are the most optimistic, and they believe that men and women should be equal. And this equality can be achieved through gradual reforms. Now, can you think of any reforms that have created more equality between men and women? Liberal feminists call for a culture change in prejudices and stereotypes about gender roles, and they believe that this should be done via socialisation. They reject that biological differences make women less competent. That's one of the feminist criticisms of science, by the way. Anne Oakley pointed out that sex means biological differences between men and women. However, gender is a culturally constructed difference, so they're 2 different things. Gender differences are arguably socially constructed. So can you think of any forms of female identity that is actually socially constructed, for example? And these are transmitted by a socialisation. So therefore, we need to change the socialisation process. Now, how can we do this? One way would be to change the role models in education, change the stereotypes in the media, maybe more female anchors on the news. Possibly an education campaign for young mums about how to not give your children a gender role socialisation. They are very optimistic. They say socialisation is changing and overcoming ignorance. And they point to all the political action that's led to anti-discriminatory laws. One of the interesting things about liberal feminists is that they are basically feminists for men, and they believe that equality will allow men to express their feminine nurture side, like yummy daddies, I suppose. The criticism, clearly too optimistic, that we need more radical change, and the fact is that they seem to be ignoring some of the structures of subordination, like patriarchy and capitalism. And they also offer no real explanation for the inequality. Now, radical feminists have a much more radical view. And I'm really sorry, again, this is also cut off half of the PowerPoint. Firestone is one of the key radical feminists, argued that the origins of patriarchy lie in childbirth, which means that women end up depending on men, both through the process of being pregnant, carrying the baby, giving birth, and being physically dependent on the man and financially afterwards. So radical feminists emerged in the early 1970s. They were very critical of the liberal feminist movement that it did not go far enough. They said patriarchy is universal and is the main cause of inequality and conflict. All men oppress women and benefit from patriarchy, even those that don't, even the stay-at-home dads. They argued that the personal domain is arguably political. So yes, patriarchy occurs in the workplace and politics, but also in this private sphere of the family, domestic labour, and sexual relationships. Radical feminists are very critical of sexual relationships between men and women. and they believe the process of sex is actually a physical domination of men over women. They call this sexual politics, and this is where some of the patriarchy comes from sex. Now, interestingly, radical feminists argue that this idea that wanting to have sex is a natural biological urge is actually something that the male stream wants us to believe. And it's this idea that's shared through the media, that everyone should want to have sex. And they say that actually this is only a social construction that's been created to satisfy men's sexual desires. There is no real desire to constantly have sex, for example. It's just something that men want us to believe so that we have sex with them and satisfy their desires. Now, for radical feminists, they believe in radical change, separatism, so living apart from men and creating a culture of female independence. This is one of Germaine Greer's key ideas, that we should have all female matrilocal households as an alternative to the heterosexual family. The most extreme branch of radical feminism is political lesbianism, where heterosexual relationships are literally seen as sleeping with the enemy and as oppressive, and lesbianism is the only form of non-oppressive sexuality. Now, one of the criticisms, or a number of the criticisms, is from Marx: class, not gender, is the main source of conflict and exploitation. Another criticism is they assume that all women are the same. They ignore the differences between classes and ethnic differences. Separatism is not only unlikely, but it actually doesn't get rid of patriarchy from society. It's still going to be there in the media, in politics, and education, maybe not within that home, but everywhere else in society. And liberal feminists argue that patriarchy is already in decline due to reforms in education, in home, and in politics. Finally, we've got the Marxist feminists. Now, for them, women's subordination can be traced back to capitalism, resulting from their unpaid role as a homemaker and making them dependent on the men. Subordination has several functions for capitalism. Women are a source of cheap labour. They are overrepresented in some of the lowest paid jobs in the country and the world. They're a reserve army of labour that can be moved in and out of the economy depending on how well the economy is doing. When the economy is failing, women retreat into their housewife role. When it's doing well, they come out of the house and work, and they take up careers. They reproduce the workforce. They absorb the anger. Now, if you remember, Fran Ansley said that women are the takers of the shit of the capitalist economy. And in order to change, women need to overthrow capitalism to be free. Now, this has been cut off your PowerPoint, what a surprise. But Barrett is very critical of the ideology of familism. She says that this belief in the family being good for you and wholesome is actually very damaging to women. The nuclear family oppresses women, and they are suppressed and repressed into marriage and babies because it's held up as being such an ideal form of life through the media, family, education, etc. Therefore, women must overthrow the ideology of familism, in order to be free from patriarchy and capitalist oppression. Criticisms fails to explain women's subordination in non-capitalist societies. So, for example, communist Russia, communist China, communist Cuba, still huge inequalities between men and women. Doesn't really focus on why men, especially working class men, oppress women. Doesn't actually say why and benefit from their unpaid labour. Surely working class men should be on the side of the working class women. And difference feminism argue that the feminist theory follows a false universality that all women are, and all women are actually not the same.